My name is Shannon Reed. I've been a wrestling fan since the mid-1980s. I consider myself a casual historian. I'm also a professional wrestler. This podcast is dedicated to wrestling's glory days. I'm talking about the NWA, Mid-South Wrestling, Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and more. Maybe you want to get extreme with ECW. Well, you can do it all right here on this podcast because we're going to have something for everybody. And yeah, we'll talk about modern wrestling as well. So tune in right here on Read This with Shannon Reed. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Read This with Shannon Reed, a classic wrestling podcast. And today we're going to be focusing on the topic of ECW, specifically our picks for the top 15 ECW MVPs. And joining me is a big wrestling fan and a friend of mine, Mr. Kota Hawkins. Kota, how are you doing today?
I'm great. How are you?
Good. You ready to talk about some Extreme Championship Wrestling?
I have been ready since you brought the subject up to me.
Awesome. I certainly grew up watching ECW in the 90s, and it was my favorite by far of like the big three promotions. I preferred it to WCW or WWF. And I know you'll be coming at it from kind of a different perspective because you're much younger and kind of got up to speed on ECW later on.
That is very true. I was born in 1997, so that's when ECW was big then. It only got bigger. The Attitude Era was just starting. And even though I was born in 1997, I still tell people I grew up on the Attitude Era because those are the VHS tapes I grew up on. I wasn't really watching live SmackDown, Raw, and stuff like that. I was watching ECW tapes and other stuff from the Attitude Era. So.
Gotcha. What was your first exposure to ECW?
My first exposure to ECW, my cousins, they got me into wrestling. Their names are Jimmy and Jake, and they had Heatwave 98 on VHS. And I watched one match, and it was RVD and Sabu versus Hayabusa and Jinsei Shinzaki, also known as Hakushi in the WWE. And from then I was hooked. If I could find a video anywhere, I would. It was actually kind of hard finding VHSs of ECW, but I grew up in that internet era where as soon as YouTube was a thing, I found everything.
Gotcha. I was fortunate enough I've only attended 2 ECW events, and both were in Dayton, Ohio, and they were Heatwave 98 and Heatwave 99. So I was actually at the first show that you saw, and I remember that one of probably the thing I was looking forward to most was seeing Hayabusa. That combination of the 2 tag teams was like a dream match. And I know Shinzaki had been in, as you said, WWF as Hakushi, and I was a fan of his, but seeing Hayabusa live for the first and probably his only ever North American appearance was something I was really looking forward to, as I had been watching him in FMW and first saw him when he wrestled in the 1994 Super J Cup. And so I was a fan, and that was just a really cool match to see.
Yeah, Hayabusa ended up becoming one of my favorite wrestlers ever. I have a lot of favorite wrestlers ever, but he's in my top 20 ever. Everything about him is just awesome. His mask, like his whole presentation. He's a fantastic wrestler. He doesn't need to deathmatch wrestle, but like when he does it, it's awesome. Especially like the exploding matches with Onita. He's so cool.
Yeah, he really stood out in kind of the blood and guts FMW style, and I still think that his 450 splash is like the prettiest of all the 450 splashes that anybody's ever done.
It's up there. Too Cold Scorpio can hit a really good one too, but it's definitely up there.
Yeah, I give Too Cold credit because he was the first one, not only that I saw do it, but I think he was the first one to do it, period. At the 1992 Clash of Champions where he debuted teaming with Ron Simmons. But yeah, he would have to be like the front runner for 450 splashes. I personally would go Hayabusa, but I always like to give credit to the originator. So Too Cold is definitely right up there with him in my book.
I completely understand.
Yeah. So today, with us going over our picks for the top 15 ECW MVPs, it's kind of interesting how, again, I'll be coming from the perspective of someone that lived through it and watched it in real time, but
Right.
you'll have a much different perspective as someone who's looking at it from a modern fan, so to speak, someone who's looking at it as far as didn't watch it live, but went back and watched it. And it'll be interesting to see how your perspective kind of matches with my own, because we're coming at it from two very different ways.
Yeah, I'm really excited for this. You know, you and I, we've messaged each other before, just talking about ECW and other old school wrestling. Sorry, hold 1 second.
You good?
But I have been incredibly excited for this, especially since we'll have different views. It's not even really an age thing. It's just at the time that we were watching, because you were watching live, some literally live there, and I never got that chance, but still.
Yeah, I was lucky to get to go to those, and the only reason I went to those two events, it wasn't like I lived in Ohio, but my best friend Aaron lived in Ohio, and so I made a trip out of it. I would have been 18 at the time of Heatwave '98, and I took a bus for like 24 hours to get to Ohio to see my friend Aaron and get to go watch that show. So. And actually, I got to meet RVD before the Heatwave event. I was wearing my New Jack shirt, and I wish I still had the photo I got with him in the parking lot, but unfortunately, it's been lost to time. I guess we can go ahead and kind of get our list underway. I figured we could start at like our number 15 picks, and then kind of go from there. I'll let you go first with your number 15 pick, and then I'll kind of go over who my number 15 pick is and see how our list kind of compare. And also, before you start, if you can kind of go over the kind of criteria that you use to make your selections.
Yeah, of course. So I obviously went by a couple things. Favoritism for sure, like who I enjoyed seeing, who I think had the most impact on ECW. Revolutionary, best matches, just who was really captivating to me, and who I also think helped the business from a fan's perspective.
Mm-hmm.
With that being said, my number 15 might surprise you a little bit. It's Francine. She, to me, is the first true diva. She radiated confidence. And she, in my opinion, she made Shane Douglas feel bigger than he was. I don't have a ton to say on her. I mean, she's awesome. But Francine is my number 15.
Francine is someone that was there for the majority of ECW's run. And I always, remember her with Shane Douglas, and they were a main event duo. She complimented him, very well, and she was called the Queen of Extreme for a reason. She was, if you look at the females especially, I think the first ones you think of are Francine and Buela Mcgillicuddy. Mm-hmm. And Francine was always, there for, when Joey Styles would scream, "Cat fight! Cat fight!" She was never afraid to get in the mix. I remember, I think it was Rhino pile drove her through a table, jumping off the apron. Mm-hmm. So she had just as much balls as all of the other ECW regulars.
She definitely did. She deserves so much more credit than she's given in the whole wrestling industry, in my opinion. I mean, and hardcore fans, I would say maybe give her credit. Part of me also wishes that she went to WWE just so she could have had that bigger spotlight on her. because I think they could have found something pretty cool for her to do in the invasion angle.
Mm-hmm.
It is what it is.
Yeah, and I think that at any point Francine could have done something in WWE. She was certainly, she certainly had the look for it. But I'm glad as a fan that she was in ECW, just because she was one of those core people that you associated with, what was my favorite wrestling promotion at the time. And like I said, balls of steel, and doesn't get enough credit when talking about people that, were kind of a heart and soul of ECW.
I agree.
So for my list, my criteria kind of went like this. The number one criteria that I used was impact. People that I think were kind of had the biggest impact in ECW from a not just a business perspective, but just when you think of ECW, these are the people that are most synonymous with it. My second criteria was kind of just a little bit different. People that just kind of captured the heart and soul of what ECW was about, from the strong, hard work rate and just putting it all out there, balls to the wall, wrestling each match kind of like it was their last. My third criteria is longevity. That's where it gets kind of tough, because there's guys that were in ECW forever that you associate with ECW. And then there's guys that kind of came in for a cup of coffee and may have been better than the people that were, say, there long term. But I took longevity into account. Like I remember vividly the feeling when I first saw Rey Mysterio Jr. wrestle Psychosis. Mm-hmm. One of the best matches in ECW history, September of 1995 at the ECW Arena. I put neither guy on my list, even though I would rank them as far as the top performers in ECW history, very close to the top, for sure. But I really tried to use longevity as a factor, and the reality is Psychosis only had a few matches in ECW, and Rey just had a handful more than he did. It was spread out over a longer period. So longevity was a factor, and my final criteria is their in-ring ability to an extent. Like that, it's definitely a factor. And a little bias too, like you said, because there's going to be performers whose style I preferred over others. So I'll go ahead and get to my number 15. And it's a tag team that I would say that they didn't have a ton of longevity, but in the time that they were there, they made a strong impact. And this would be Perry Saturn and John Cronus, the Eliminators.
Of course.
I remember the first time I saw the Eliminators was at a random ECW TV show, like on a random episode in 1985. They were in a match against the Pitbulls. I think it may have even been like a 6-man. Maybe they were teaming with Jason, who I think was their manager at the time, Jason Knight. And just right away, you could see their athletic ability. And throughout 1996 and into 1997, you could just see that the Eliminators had something really special as a tag team. What they lacked in longevity, they made up for with a very athletic and unique style. A lot of us at the time were convinced that they were the best tag team in the world. And Paul E and Joey Styles, they would tell us on TV every week, this is the best tag team in the world. In hindsight, I think that from a pure worker standpoint, I think Owen Hart and Davey Boy Smith were better as far as I'm looking at like 1997. But the Eliminators, as far as just excitement and athleticism, John Cronus with the 450 splash, he's another one. We were talking about 450 splashes.
That's true.
That'd have to be my top 3 would be Hayabusa, Too Cold, and John Cronus in whatever order. But he was a kind of a bigger guy, but just, you could tell he had like a gymnastic background, and Saturn was the better worker of the two overall. And just together, they really had something, and it was really too bad when they split up. But the Eliminators, my number 15 pick.
I like that. And it is too bad that they split up, because after they split up, what else really happened? But I'll never forget, it's when ECW invaded Raw, March of '97. Might have been late February. And I can't remember the name of their finish was it the Eliminator?
Total Elimination.
Total Elimination. Yeah, they hit it on a camera guy, I think. And it's just awesome. They just completely laid him out. That's my favorite memory of them. And it's not even really an ECW memory, but still.
That was one of the best tag team finishers of all time. And they always had really great timing. And that move probably sucked to take.
Probably.
Yeah.
All right. You want me to move on to my number 14?
Yes.
All right. The first member of the Triple Threat, I have Bam Bigelow on here. He is my number 14. I debated putting him. I guess Francine was a member of the Triple Threat as well, but you get my point. I have Bam at 14. Really, it's because of the match with Taz, where they go through the stage. It was in his hometown. I think he did enough. I think he did the right amount for ECW during the time, because he was a big name coming off of WWE, and he proved that he could work better than a lot of people thought too.
So you're not going to believe this, but I have Bam number 14 as well.
Really?
It was funny because I flipped him in the Eliminators about an hour ago. And a lot of that had to do with the Eliminators. Like I said, the one thing that holds them back for me is longevity. And it's not that Bam had a much longer run, but what I can say about Bam is when he came into ECW, which would have been, I believe, 97, he had been in the WWF recently. He had kind of bounced back and forth between upper mid card, sometimes in a main event spot. I know he had the match with Lawrence Taylor. And then he kind of ended on kind of like a babyface, middle of the card run, and he had some issues with the Click, and then he was gone. And so he showed up in ECW, and it really felt like he was reborn. All of a sudden, Bam was in there having these, great matches where he's just working his butt off. One of his most memorable matches was he wrestled Rob Van Dam in Buffalo, New York, in a match that aired on the ECW television show. And it was one of the best ECW matches that year. And then you think about how he had the feud with Spike Dudley, where he would press Spike Dudley above his head and throw him into the crowd, which was crazy at the time because stuff like that didn't happen all the time back then. And the Triple Threat was a main event act with him and Shane Douglas and Chris Candido, three like legit talents. And you have the Taz feud where Bam got suplexed all over the place. And I believe it was at Heatwave 98 that I was at where he took the Tazplex or the T-bone off the stage and into the crowd over the guardrail. And I was actually one of the people that kind of was getting close to the action at that point. And I used to have a great photo of him like coming out into the crowd, but I don't have it anymore. But I have Bam at 14 because worked his butt off, had great matches with everybody, and he really, to me, captured the heart and soul of what ECW was, which is when you take someone and you get the most out of them. And I think that was one of Bam Bam's stronger runs.
I would agree. I would say it was his strongest run because if somebody mentions Bam Bigelow to me, I think about the WrestleMania main event, but really I think of Lawrence Taylor. I think of ECW if somebody mentions Bam Bigelow. And I think about his matches with Taz and the fact that a lot of people don't realize RVD is the one that beat him for that long title reign. All right, on to number 13.
Yes.
Yep. All right, because 14 was for you. Was
I was getting confused, but I remember we both had the same pick. So yes, it'd be your number 13.
My number 13, former ECW heavyweight champion, Mike Awesome. Mike Awesome actually wasn't originally on my list at all. He was an honorable mention. And then I went back, rewatched some stuff, mostly his stuff with Masato Tanaka. And I just thought there's no way I can't. I have to put him somewhere. And, the match with him, Masato Tanaka, and Taz gets his send-off, his farewell. He was, no pun intended, but he was awesome. Like, a man that size should not be able to move like that. There's only a few in history who, can move that well, that size. And badass entrance music. But his matches with Masato Tanaka is basically what put it over for me as my number 13.
Awesome. Mike Awesome was an honorable mention for me. He would have made my top 20 if we had gone to a top 20. I agree with pretty much everything that you said. Now, Mike Awesome, he actually used to be in ECW years before that time. In 1993, he actually had a cup of coffee in ECW, and there was this famous clip of him where he did a flying dive over the top rope onto JT Smith and smashed his back against the guardrail. And I believe it was on the opening to the TV show for years. All right, so back to talking about Mike Awesome. So the dive he did on the JT Smith was one of the all-time ECW highlight reels. And again, that was in 1993. And then the next time I saw him would have been in FMW, where he was one of their standout guys. I remember watching him wrestling Hayabusa. He would team with whoever the top heels were, and he was known as the Gladiator. But when I think of Mike Awesome, kind of like what you were saying, without a doubt, the first series of matches I think of are Mike Awesome and Masato Tanaka. I remember how crazy it was at the time when he would powerbomb Masato over the top rope through all those tables. They did it all the time, and I just thought that just seemed like an impossible bump to take. And they did it on One Night Stand, I believe, too, at the the WWE show.
Yeah, he powerbombed Masato Tanaka over the ropes through the table to the floor, and then the camera doesn't cut, so you just see Mike Awesome diving and landing right on Masato Tanaka. So it's pretty sweet. That match is really good too.
Yeah, they were having just tremendous matches. If I had to rank the best series of matches ever in ECW, that has to be top 3 for me. It's just a classic series, and Mike Awesome, like you said, was very athletic at a time where guys like that didn't have to be. He wasn't particularly charismatic or good on promos, but his in-ring stuff was so cool that it made him over, especially with a ECW audience who was geared towards that type of style anyway. I remember watching guys like Kevin Nash and those kind of guys in WCW and wondering how people could be more into him than someone like Mike Awesome, who's doing all this cool stuff. But that's just how wrestling was at the time. But yeah, Mike Awesome just narrowly missed my list. Would have made my top 20, and definitely someone that is worthy of a lot of respect.
All right. So have you gotten to your number 13 yet?
No. All right. So number 13 for me. Number 13 is a guy that we actually mentioned earlier when talking about the 450 splash. My number 13 is Cold Scorpio. Scorpio, I obviously had watched for years in WCW and in the WWF as Flash Funk, and he was always a very good wrestler and one of wrestling's best high flyers at the time. When he went to ECW, which would have been in 1994, he initially he was coming off of a tag team with Marcus Alexander Bagwell, and he was just kind of a WCW generic guy that came in with a good reputation as a wrestler to wrestle Sabu in a series of matches. And the first ECW tape I ever saw was Hardcore Heaven '94, where he wrestled Sabu. And they had a very good match. And then a couple years later, they had an even better match at CyberSlam '96, which was one of the best matches in ECW history. My favorite Too Cold work in ECW was when he was a heel in 1995. He was a tag champ with the Sandman. I really think he was one of the best guys in the business in that era of '95, '96. And I think that, now that I say that, I'm getting my timelines a little mixed up because he actually went to the WWF after this and did the Flash Funk thing.
I think he went in late '95, early '96 to WWE.
I think it was late '96.
It was later.
Yeah, it was later because he wrestled Chris Jericho on A Doctor Is In the summer of '96 for ECW, and he debuted I think that November at the Survivor Series as Flash Funk because that was the same card where Doug Furnas and Phil LaFawn and Rocky Maivia debuted, and that would have been the '96 Survivor Series. So he actually went there directly from ECW. But I was getting my timelines mixed up earlier when I said I'd watched him as Flash Funk before ECW. That wasn't the case.
Too Cold Scorpio actually was on my list and then got bumped off for Mike Awesome. Essentially, I think of the same stuff of Too Cold Scorpio. The 450 splash match with Sabu. I don't think of anything he did in WWE, to be honest, when I hear his name. I think about his title match with Shane Douglas, but more so because of Douglas's promo at the end of it.
Where he threw down the belt.
Yeah. I don't have a whole lot to say about Too Cold Scorpio, but he's awesome. Love watching him. Nothing bad to say about him.
Yeah, and going back to what you said about how you bumped him from the list for Mike Awesome, making these kind of lists, it's kind of hard because depending on the day, you could change the order or how you feel. Mike Awesome was the world champion of the company, had some of the best matches in company history, and if you ask me on another week, I very well could put him ahead of Too Cold in the sense of the impact that he made in ECW. But for Too Cold, I know in '95 and '96 he was pretty great as a worker, and so on this particular day, I chose to go with him.
I completely understand. It's whatever you're feeling that day, really, when it comes to lists like this. Doing a top 15 was difficult. It was difficult.
I wanted to do. I kept wanting to add guys. I wanted to make it a top 20, top 25 because I wanted to be able to recognize everybody.
I mean, I think that's good. It's a good reason that we have honorable mentions, because the fact that they're not in the top 15 isn't because we thought they weren't good enough. It's just it's so hard, and I honestly didn't expect a top 15 for ECW to be this difficult, and I also didn't think that the depth of talent would be this deep. I mean, I knew they had a bunch of people, but once I had it in front of me, it was a different story.
Right. Yeah, there was so many people that were a big part of ECW that really deserve to be mentioned. Guys that didn't make my list, and I don't know if they'll make your list either, but maybe at the end we can kind of mention some of those people.
For sure. We can do it before number 1. All right, so my number 12 is No Gimmicks Needed, Chris Candido. Chris Candido, in my opinion, is one of the biggest stars ever to not become the biggest star ever. And I think he wrestled at a great time, but I feel like if he wrestled nowadays, simply because of his gimmick, which wasn't a gimmick, he would be appreciated so much more. And not that the ECW crowd didn't appreciate him, they did, but the rest of the wrestling world. Like, we're not even going to talk about his WWE stuff. I feel like that's just out. The dude, he didn't know how to have a bad match, ever. You could have put a broomstick in there, and it would have been a 5-star classic. That basically alone is why Chris Candido is my number 12. And in every good wrestling stable, you need that guy who can go 110% every single night. And Chris Candido was that guy. Kind of like how like Steve Austin was for the Dangerous Alliance. I feel like that's, I know it's not that much of a comparison, but I compare it in that way.
Chris Candido was someone I had as an honorable mention. He would have made my top 20 if I had done the top 20. I was always a big Chris Candido fan. The first time I saw him was in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. He had come up with Tammy Fitch, who was Tammy Sitch, and later Sunny, of course, his girlfriend at the time. Right away, I can see that he was a special talent. He had only been wrestling for a few years, but he wrestled like a veteran. And Smoky Mountain had a lot of the kind of Southern style gimmicky matches. Like he had a feud with Tim Horner where if he lost, he had to wear a baby bonnet on his head, and he would put the bonnet on and then sit in the ring and pout and cry and he really worked for that Southern audience because he was a great kind of chicken shit heel. He was a good promo. He was a great wrestler. He started teaming with Primetime Brian Lee, and they won the Smoky Mountain Tag Belts, and that was his first kind of main event spot. But throughout that time, he was also getting a reputation on the indies because he was wrestling Sabu. I know they had a cage match on an independent show at the time, which was well regarded. The WWF run, like you said, it was disappointing because he was a great talent and they gave him a stupid gimmick, which is not uncommon.
Especially in that time.
Right. But then he went to ECW and things got a lot better. He was part of the main event stable, the Triple Threat. He had the tag team with Lance Storm. That was a lot of fun. And he was always someone that worked his butt off, could do anything in the ring. He did that top rope power bomb, which was crazy at the time. I wouldn't have wanted to take that shit.
It still is crazy.
Yeah. So I was always a big Candido fan, and in the Triple Threat, like you said, he was the heater. He was the Buddy Roberts of the Freebirds. He was the guy that could get beat and he'd still maintain his heat, allowing Bam Bam and Shane to continue to be strong. With Chris Candido, you could beat him every night and he's going to stay over. And I wish, and I remember later he went to TNA and then he had the accident and the match with Sonny Siaki and then the unfortunate tragedy that, went on to occur. But I always a big Candido fan and definitely someone that's a good choice for you to pick on your list.
So who's your number 12?
So my number 12 is another tag team that I'm largely putting on here for impact. They went on to become more famous in the WWF. I'm talking about the Dudley Boys.
They're your number 12?
They're my number 12. What? Are you thinking that's too high or too low?
Do you want me to tell you where I have them?
Yeah, go ahead.
They're my number 2.
They're your number 2?
They're my number 2.
Okay, so let me explain why I have them at number 12.
Okay.
So when the Dudleys first started, Bubba did this like stuttering gimmick. They were a babyface squad of like 7 or 8 different Dudleys that each had their own gimmick and name. There was Sign Guy Dudley, Dudley, Big Dick Dudley.
Big Dick Dudley.
Yeah. And so the Dudleys were just kind of there as kind of like a mid-card, low-card kind of comedy thing, right? And it wasn't until they turned heel, which would have been in 90. Well, no, they were heels when they wrestled the Eliminators at Barely Legal. So it would have been uh, either late 96 or early 97 was around the time they turned heel. When they turned heel, they started coming into their own. They won the ECW tag titles. They had the feuds with the Gangstonators, John Cronus and New Jack. But really, the reason I have them at number 12, and this was actually, for me, it was actually somewhat of a high rating for them, that I'm largely doing because they were a main event heel tag team that had a lot of heat. The crowd absolutely hated them. They main evented the 1999 Heat Wave that I went to against Tommy Dreamer and the Sandman, I recall, something like that. But I have them largely because they were a pushed, incredible heel team that got great heat, that had some longevity. They weren't my personal favorites, so there's not really a bias. Perhaps I would have had them higher if I did. But I have the Dudleys at number 12.
I can respect your reasoning behind it. I have them at number 2 strictly because, in my opinion, their impact and the heat that Bubba could get was out of this world. And maybe it's because fans were super drunk or because Bubba would say the most horrible things to people. But that alone, like, if they were on my TV right now and I wasn't doing this, like, my eyes would be glued, even if I've seen the promo a million times. I mean, even his famous promo where he tells a mother that she taught her daughter how to do something. And I feel like they often not, once they became a heel tag team, had a bad match. When they were main eventing, it was so deserved. And a little side note here, I think Devon Dudley deserves a lot more credit as part of that tag team, especially in ECW, because before him and Bubba were tagging like exclusively, they had a series of singles matches together that were pretty solid. So I really like Devon. I've always been a big fan of Devon. I think he's very smart and viciously underrated. Even in the WWE, he took a lot of spots that he probably didn't want to take in those ladder matches simply because he's a little smaller than Bubba. That's essentially why they're my number 2.
They're a real testament to the genius of Paul Heyman because in the landscape of 1995, the Dudley gimmick, just taking guys who, without that gimmick, were just kind of journeyman wrestlers that were just on random independence. And Bubba actually got the stuttering thing over. In the dancing that he did in the ring, he was very popular at the time. And then it's weird how that kind of just comedic stable that was in the middle of the card turned into a legitimate main event heel act. And that's also a testament to how hard Bubba and Devon worked.
Truly is. I believe we're on 11 now, right?
Yes.
All right. I have Jerry Lynn for number 11, and it is almost exclusively and 100% because of his matches with Rob Van Dam. I think they are art. It's artwork on a television screen. Honestly, my least favorite match of theirs was the very last televised ECW match ever, Guilty as Charged 2001. But even that is so good. They just flow well together. Their chemistry was off the charts. They could have a good match today. And I don't know a ton about Jerry Lynn's career as a whole, but those series of matches are the best series of matches in ECW, in my opinion. And it got me hooked onto Rob Van Dam too. The first time I ever saw Rob Van Dam was the Heat Wave 98. And then immediately after that, I found all the matches of Jerry Lynn like a few years later on YouTube.
Gotcha. I have Jerry Lynn as an honorable mention. I know it gets kind of cliche at this point. I keep saying my honorable mentions would have made my top 20, but you keep naming the ones that I had actually from my 15 to 20 spot that we're not using.
Yeah.
So Jerry Lynn, I first saw him when he was in a promotion called the GWF in 1991. GWF was a promotion based out of Dallas that had television on ESPN. They were funded by some multi-millionaire that put a lot of money and brought in like a lot of talent to have these shows. And it was, since it was on ESPN it was like at 3:00 in the afternoon where I lived, it was on 5 days a week. So you got like 5 different shows a week. And what Jerry Lynn did there that most people remember was he had a series of matches with the Lightning Kid, Sean Waltman. And that was Sean Waltman's first kind of major exposure. So that was the first time that I was exposed to Jerry Lynn. And then I see his name on some of the independents, and then he showed up in WCW as Mr. JL. The JL stands for Jerry Lynn. He wore a mask, and he was a part of their cruiserweight division, and he was a very good worker, had good matches, but he got lost in the shuffle, and the gimmick limited him, and he never got used to his full capacity. So once again, you got to turn to the genius of Paul Heyman, who recognized Jerry Lynn's talent. So Jerry Lynn comes into ECW, and I believe the first series of matches, like as far as a program that he had, was with Just Incredible.
Those were great. Those were great.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it would predate the RVD series, and they had a series of matches on kind of the middle of the card, which really actually bumped up ECW's show quality, because there was a period where their low to mid cards were not as strong as like WCW's, where they had the Luchadors and Eddie and Jericho and all those guys. When they lost all those guys, sometimes the middle of their cards and the opening matches kind of went down a little bit. But when Jerry Lynn and Just Incredible came in, they were part of kind of what brought it back up, I felt. But whenever anybody thinks of Jerry Lynn and ECW, obviously the first go-to is the series of matches with Rob Van Dam. Mm-hmm. Some of the best matches in ECW history. I would rank it as, one of the best rivalries as far as match quality in the company. Off the top of my head, we should do a show about that sometime. But it would be up there, and I certainly wouldn't argue anyone who chose it as their number one. But Jerry Lynn, always a very good talent. He went on to wrestle for several more years in TNA, and I'm glad that he's in AEW right now as a producer, because he's someone that always worked hard, was always great, and didn't always get the best opportunities. And so it's good that he's still recognized as the talent that he was.
Yep. And I could be wrong here. I don't think I am, but I believe he's also a former Ring of Honor World Champion.
You're speaking modern wrestling to me. So.
But in 2002, 2003. But just to add that, I'm pretty sure he is. I could be wrong. I don't think I am. But to add to his accolades, there's that as well.
He might very well be, and he would fit in with what Ring of Honor was trying to be at the time, which was the pure wrestling with the kind of focus on like scientific stuff, and so yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if he was. I'm not as up to date on my modern history, and for me, 2002 is still modern history.
Oh no.
Now, if you ask me, what was the opening match at Starrcade '86, I could say it like that, but yeah, I'm if he was, I'm happy for him, because Jerry Lynn was a great talent.
Awesome. Your number.
So
11?
I guess it's So going to move on to my number 11, and this is a guy who you kind of mentioned earlier when you were talking about somebody else. My number 11 is Masato Tanaka. So Masato, I already talked a lot about Mike Awesome But Masato Tanaka was his opponent in that great series of matches. And as far as the heart of ECW, not only was Masato great in the ring as like just a wrestler, but the punishment he was willing to put his body through, not only getting power bombed over the top rope through tables, but the chair shots that he would take to the head.
Yeah.
Just a great talent, had great matches with everybody that he faced. I mean, his match with Doug Furnas at WrestlePalooza '97 was kind of disappointing, but really Masato Tanaka, just top level performer, was very good in FMW, and I think ECW really gave him a chance to shine in the U.S. in a way that he probably wouldn't have gotten the opportunity in the other companies because he was a little small as far as height goes, and his style was so spectacular that it would have, scared away the big two companies, and he wouldn't have been able to really to stand out that way. And then, so when I think when you think of the heart and soul of ECW and the guys that just put it all out there, he is very close to the top of the list.
Yeah, I don't. Besides his ECW stuff, I don't know a ton about Masato Tanaka's career. I've seen some of his stuff in Japan, not a ton.
He still wrestles.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, I know he still wrestles. I watched something recently, like within a year recently. I can't remember who he wrestled. The one thing I have to say, like the one thing I think of about Masato Tanaka is just images of Mike Awesome hitting him square in the head with a chair harder than anybody should ever be hit, and he's fine. Like it's not human.
Yeah, it's an unfortunate thing, and not only Mike Awesome, but he had some really good matches with Balls Mahoney also at the time, where they gave each other insane chair shots, and at the time, it's really hard today to think about it and rewatch it because we know so much more about concussions and CTE, but at the time, seeing that stuff was just absolutely insane, and I hate that in a way that we kind of supported that and we kind of, encouraged that. But whatever got it there, it was impressive to see that they were willing to take that kind of punishment.
Yeah, and obviously we don't know them personally, but on the bright side, Masato Tanaka seems to be okay after all those chair shots.
I know Balls did get diagnosed with CTE after he passed away.
Yeah, I did see that. And like guys like Mick Foley, that's just got to be good karma because I've heard he's a great human being. And I mean, we've all seen the match against The Rock, the Last Man Standing, or the I Quit match, where it was just too violent. Like that, it's hard for me to watch that match. But
yeah,
not to get off on a tangent, we can move on.
No, Foley is someone that kind of made the bed that a lot of these guys laid in.
He definitely did. All right, my number 10 is I believe he is the final original ECW champion ever. I have Rhino at number 10. And the reason I have Rhino at number 10, and this might seem like a high ranking to you, this one's more so just favoritism. He's just somebody who really captured my eye. His finish, like the way he hit the gore, we didn't really see people hitting spears on other people back in the day the way they do now. I mean, I think Edge started spearing people in like 2001, and that was super established as Rhino's finish in ECW by the time. And the way he would just completely gore people through tables, it was just everything Rhino touched towards that last end of ECW was gold to me. And I think if ECW stayed in business, Rhino would be a much, much bigger name than he is
now. Rhino did not make my list, but he is someone that absolutely captures the heart of ECW. He came in towards the latter years of the company, but he was always a very hard worker that had great matches. And it's funny because he has kind of this like kind of unique body type. And by calling him Rhino, like I always wondered, is that why they call him Rhino? Because maybe you could say he's got kind of a build like a rhinoceros. It's not your standard build. He's like stocky in weird places, but he looks like a beast. Like he looks like he would just like run through you and take your girlfriend. You know,
he's the man beast. Yeah. And I do believe that is actually why he was named Rhino. He went to the same wrestling school as Edge and Christian, and in Edge's documentary, he mentions like practically as soon as he walked in the room, Edge named him Rhino. So I don't know how true that is, but Edge takes credit for it, which I think is a cool little story.
And I think that, you know, he had a nice, you know, he didn't get to have the status in WWE that he did in ECW, but he did get to tack on several more years to his career. And I think that's because when he was in ECW, he was relatively young. Mm-hmm. And so WWE brought him in. He was still fresh. He was still a new person for people to see. And even up until a few years ago, he still had another run. I think, who was the guy who was with? Heath Slater, I think.
Yeah, they won the tag titles at Backlash 2016.
Right, and they didn't get to stay, you know, in that spot for very long. But it's a testament to Rhino that even 15 years later, he's still able to be put in a position like that and deliver.
Yeah, and I think he's with Impact now. I actually think he wrestled last night. I feel like he's always a good guy to have on the card because it's a decent name. And if you're a younger talent, it's definitely not a bad guy to ask for questions. He's seen a lot and been through a lot of errors.
Yeah, I would say anybody that is a kind of a strong man that has some athleticism, that maybe isn't the tallest guy around, but wants to know how to use their body in a way that they can throw around guys that are much taller or much bigger and seem just as much of a beast. You know, Rhino may have been a precursor to guys like Jeff Cobb today, as far as guys of, you know, that aren't super tall, but still can, you know, get in there and throw it down with anybody as far as beast mode, you know.
I think your Jeff Cobb comparison is perfect. I mean, if you're going to say anybody's like a Rhino nowadays, it's Jeff Cobb. So I like that.
Yeah.
All right, go ahead.
So next is my number 10. And for my number 10 is a guy that we started talking about a little bit ago. I have Cactus Jack.
Okay. Interesting.
So Cactus Jack was mostly known for being in WCW for years and years, and he was a guy that had many great matches in that company. When he initially came in 1990, he wasn't doing much. They didn't really. Some of them could see his potential. Jim Ross and Jim Cornette saw his potential, but Ole Anderson maybe didn't see all of it because he didn't understand the gimmick and the bumps and the craziness that went along with it. So Cactus left WCW, and in a thing that didn't happen at that time, he became really hot on the independent scene. He had a series of matches with Eddie Gilbert on the independents that got a lot of notoriety in the Northeast. And within a year, he was back in WCW as a main event heel against Sting. And yeah, and this was during the era that Ric Flair was gone, and his big opponents, Sting's big opponents, were either Vader, Rick Rude, or Cactus Jack. And he had some of Sting's best matches, including the Falls Count Anywhere match at Beach Blast 92. Mm-hmm. So Cactus always worked hard, took crazy bumps that seemed like no human could survive them. And then he went to ECW, and he shined in many different ways. For one, his best promo work, arguably, was in that company, especially as a heel. I loved his team with Mikey Whipwreck, where, you know, they had a kinship that ultimately led to them, when Cactus turned heel, they were at odds, and they had I think it was in maybe Queens, or maybe it was at the I think it was at the arena actually. They had a singles match, and another one of his matches is he wrestled Shane Douglas at CyberSlam '96, and they had a story of a backstory to them because they had gone to, I believe, wrestling school together in the mid '80s, and but ultimately Cactus Jack is a guy that brought some credibility to ECW at a time that they needed it. He had excellent promos. He was kind of the forerunner for the hardcore style and what everybody else was doing. And he also had a series of matches with Sabu in 1994 that helped continue to further putting Sabu on the map as a top guy.
The matches in Japan against Sabu?
No, they had a series in ECW in '94 at both the ECW arena and some other places. Like there was one where Sabu broke a glass bottle over his head, and usually Sabu was winning those matches, but yeah, he also did like the King of the Death match thing in IWA, but I have him at number 10, largely for the credibility he brought to ECW, his promos, and his heel work, and it was just very unique and inventive at the time.
Yeah, I actually have Cactus Jack on my honorable mentions. Out of all the people on my honorable mentions, I struggled with him a lot on if I should put him on the list or not, but I focus so much more on like 97 to 2001 ECW. I felt like it wouldn't have been true to my list. Yeah, honestly, the promo where I think he spits on the title in ECW. He's backstage. I'm not sure if it's a lone promo or if Joey Styles was interviewing him. I think you know the promo I'm talking about, though. And he got a lot of heat for it. And I think it was real heat. Like, I think he got heat from the locker room as well for it.
I think, okay, I'm trying to jog my memory. I think the title he spit on was a WCW tag team title.
That sounds right. Yeah, that sounds right.
And he had won those belts with Kevin Sullivan in '94. And I think that he may have spit on them on television, if memory serves.
I know he was doing an interview for sure. I know he was talking, because he was talking about how he wasn't appreciated in WCW. So yeah, it was definitely a WCW title because he spits on it. But nonetheless, that's the main thing I think of with Cactus Jack. Because if you say his name to me in passing conversation, I think of his matches with Triple H. But ECW wise, that's what I think of. It's a good pick though. My number 9 is the first tag team I have on the list. Already mentioned I have the Dudleys at 2, and we can go back over it when the time comes, but I have the Impact Players at number 9. Just Incredible, Lance Storm. They're actually my favorite tag team in ECW history, despite me having the Dudleys at 2. They felt cool to me. And it's weird to say that Lance Storm kind of felt cool. It's just the way that Just Incredible was kind of, he's the hardcore guy. Lance Storm is the pure wrestling guy with the greatest super kick of all time. And everything, I felt like everything they did, everything it touched, it was gold. And they weren't exactly around for the longest time either. I don't know if they're even going to be on your list because of longevity. They're my number 9, and that's really all I have to say.
So they're not on my list as a tag team or even as singles, but they're guys I did consider. So Lance Storm was someone that I had seen before in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, and I was an instant fan of his. I watched him and Chris Jericho as the Thrill Seekers in Smoky Mountain, and Lance immediately stuck out as a great talent. As a matter of fact, he was arguably the better of the two at that point. You could make an argument either way. Jericho had a little more personality, but Storm just seemed at least for Smoky Mountain, to really complement Jericho and maybe bell to bell be like a half a step ahead. But again, it can go either way. But I was a fan of them because they seemed like the next Rockers. They were an old school type babyface tag team that had been not around in wrestling because the era of rock and roll and the Rockers and the Fantastics had been several years before. Now the Rock and Roll were still in Smoky Mountain Wrestling, but here was like a young, fresh tag team that seemed kind of destined to kind of go into that mold. And I thought they were going to be, a tag team forever because they certainly complemented each other like they would. But then they went their own separate ways. And then the next time I saw Lance was in 97 when he showed up at the ECW arena and debuted against Balls Mahoney. And he still had his Thrill Seekers gear. And then he went on to wrestle RVD at Barely Legal. Lance Storm was always a great talent. And you mentioned having the best super kick in wrestling history. I would disagree. I would say Chris Adams for sure. But I will say Lance Storm's rolling Boston crab, the half crab, is one of the most beautiful things ever in wrestling.
I disagree on the Chris Adams thing, but he's like kind of the OG, so I can respect it. But the half crab, yeah, I love watching people do it now. It's such a beautiful move. I'm blanking right now. There's a female wrestler in WWE who does that exact transition into a half crab, and it'll come to me probably after this podcast is over, but it's such a beautiful move, and everything Lance touches, it's so smooth. You could compare him in smoothness wise almost to Owen Hart. I feel he's just I probably could have put him in this spot by himself and not Just Incredible, but I don't know where else I would have put Just Incredible.
They were definitely both people that I considered when I was making my list. And just going back to the half crab, like I remember at the Extreme Wrestling Center, like hitting that half crab, and I thought for my size it looked pretty good. But then like last week I saw like a clip that Lance had posted of him hitting it in WWE, and it just blows away like anybody's, like nobody could do it as smooth as him. But when him and Justin teamed, now bell to bell as workers, I would put them above any of the tag teams that are on my list as far as just in-ring ability. And Just Incredible was a guy that, I watched him as a prelim guy as PJ Walker, and then he got the Aldo Montoya gimmick, what's that?
Greatest gimmick ever.
The Portuguese Man of War, and people used to joke that he had a jock strap on his head, and but I'll tell you what, he was a good wrestler, and for they actually took someone from their prelims and actually did something with him. I felt he did well in the role. He, again, good solid wrestler. He fit in with like the 1-2-3 Kid and Bob Holly. He was kind of in that mix, and I remember being a teenager and there was a period where Aldo Montoya had these like kind of dreadlocks, like where he had like dreadlocks coming out of the top of his mask, and I wanted to get my hair like that because I thought it looked cool. Ultimately, though, he ended up leaving the WWF and went to ECW because he was a talented guy that just needed something new. And again, Paul Heyman gives him this kind of great new gimmick of Just Incredible, and he was just right off to the races. Like he was pushed hard immediately. He had the little kind of mini program with the great Sasuke, where he beat Sasuke, who was, that was a pretty big deal at the time. Yeah. He had the matches with Mikey Whipwreck and then the series with Jerry Lynn, and him and Lance Storm coming together was just kind of like, two really good talents as a legitimate main event heel team. And I think that, it's great that they made their list because I talk about guys that maybe didn't make my list, but they deserve to be recognized. And there's no doubt that when you think of ECW, you think of Just Incredible and Lance Storm.
For sure. And just to quickly comment before we move on. You mentioned the stuff Just Incredible did up to the Jerry Lynn stuff. The stuff Just Incredible did before ECW went out of business, like with Steve Carino, and that was great as well. Those matches, I think he wrestled Steve Carino at Massacre on 34th Street, and it might have been a triple threat with somebody else, but that was great as well.
And I'll admit, kind of like how you said that you skew more towards 97 to 2000, I tend to skew more 99 and prior. I was still watching ECW in 2000 and 2001, but not as religiously. And so Steve Carino is a guy that, was a really great heel at the time. And although he didn't make my list, he is someone that towards the end of ECW was absolutely one of their top guys and fit that heart and soul of ECW because he was a journeyman wrestler that had been a prelim guy in the WWF doing jobs. And he was an old school fan at heart. And then he went out there and bled buckets in ECW and did the bull rope match with Dusty Rhodes. And he had the association with Jack Victory. And it was a really cool kind of throwback to the old days.
It was. I think that's why I like it. He's the king of old school style. But I actually have Steve Carino later on my list, so I'll talk about him more later.
Well, shit, I just talked too much about him then.
We'll go over it again.
I'll bring him up. I'll be able to talk more about him later, but let's go ahead and so who were we talking about? The Impact players?
Yeah, my number 9 was the Impact players.
Okay, so my number 9 is a guy that really I felt came into his own in ECW with a genius gimmick that really fit the scene of the time. My number 9 is Raven.
Interesting.
So Raven, I had watched for years in WCW as Scotty Flamingo, and he won the light heavyweight title. Good match with Flying Brian. Went to WWF as Johnny Polo, managing the Quebecers. But then when he went to ECW, a huge transformation kind of took place. He became a main event guy right away because he really tapped into that kind of grunge, kind of Pearl Jam thing that you can relate to because I know you're a Pearl Jam fan. He really got into that whole grunge thing that was real popular at the time, and he had his kind of minions like Stevie Richards and Blue Meanie, and great promos. He had a great feud with Tommy Dreamer. He had a great feud with the Sandman, where he, I think Sandman's son was named Tyler Fullington, and there was a period where Raven was trying to like become his dad, and Tyler was starting to do the Raven pose, and so just a guy that had done some good stuff before, but really came into his own, worked his ass off. And also one of my favorite Raven matches in ECW was he wrestled Terry Bam Bam Gordy in 1996. And in 1996, Terry Gordy was not Terry Gordy. Terry Gordy had been through some health stuff, and he had very much slowed down. But in this match, Raven worked his ass off, and you felt like you were getting the old Terry Gordy from the old days. And it was really probably the last great match that Gordy had. But yeah, I have Raven at number 9. Great gimmick, great promo, great, just put it all out there, and really, a big part of ECW during that era.
Awesome. I don't have Raven on my list. I wanted to, but I was never the biggest Raven guy. I see his contributions towards ECW. His stuff with Tommy Dreamer, it was great, but for some reason just never captured me. But his story with Sandman, in my opinion, might be the most emotionally driven story ECW's ever done, because if you add a kid into it, a kid who is telling his dad, "Hey, I don't want you to be my dad. I want Raven to be my dad." And he's doing his pose, and like Raven's got a Colt. It's like the whole thing. And then, you know, Raven crucified Sandman. Like it was just whole that it was great, but I just think of that. And then when Raven returned to win the tag titles with Tommy Dreamer, they beat the Dudleys. I think it was just on ECW TV. I don't think it was a pay-per-view. That was really cool as well. So it was good. All right, so my number 8 is actually Tommy Dreamer. I'm sure it might seem a little weird that I have Tommy Dreamer at 8, but I don't have Raven on it at all. A lot of it has to do with the way Tommy Dreamer entered ECW as the jock, the clean shaved, the pretty boy. Even his gear, it was so dumb. I think he had the suspenders, and the crowd hated him. They would just boo him to hell every time. And it was when he faced Sandman in a Singapore cane match, and he lost. And I don't think people really, looking back, I don't think people really understood how this match was going to go in terms of the rules. But he just starts caning him at the end of it. We all know the story. And he doesn't give up. He actually asks for Sandman to cane him again and harder, to the point where he starts bleeding and the crowd is visibly like gasping. They're like, please stop. Even the ECW, the most popular ECW fan ever, the Straw Hat guy, he was like, this is a bit much. That was big. And I think that was to watch a guy become a star in kind of one night. It's always special. It's only happened a few times. You can argue that Stone Cold and Brett at WrestleMania made Stone Cold a star, but Stone Cold was kind of already getting there. But that was fantastic. And then his stuff was with Raven was good. But like I said, it wasn't exactly my cup of tea, because watching Raven beat Tommy Dreamer for 94 straight years wasn't really that for me. And then you could always count on Tommy Dreamer. Always. I think he missed 1 or 2 pay-per-views. He didn't miss pay-per-views really. That's why he's my number 8.
So I know when you started to talk about him, you said that I'm probably surprised that you had him at number 8. He's also my number 8.
Awesome.
So Tommy Dreamer, exactly what you said. He showed up, clean cut babyface. The Sandman match and the caning is what really got him over to the ECW crowd. And this was not a new concept. Back in 1984, when Magnum TA and Mr. Wrestling 2 wrestled the Midnight Express, the deal was whoever lost had to get 10 lashes. Well, Mr. Wrestling 2 turned heel on Magnum TA, and so Magnum not only took his 5, but he insisted on taking the 5 that Mr. Wrestling 2 was going to get as well.
Okay.
And so that kind of thing had been done before. And also, I will say another thing the Tommy Dreamer thing reminds me of is in 1986, the Fantastics, who were kind of viewed as like a copycat of the Rock and Roll Express and the Fabulous Ones, right, engaged in a series of matches with the Sheep Herders, which were bloody and violent. And it really kind of gave them like more street cred, that they were willing to get bloody. They weren't just pretty boys. They were out there ready to fight. And that's kind of what Tommy Dreamer was in ECW. He was just a kind of a white meat baby face. But then when the Sandman thing happened, they realized, okay, this guy's tough. This guy's got the heart. And from that point on, like, the reason I have Tommy Dreamer at number 8 is because you think of guys that embody the heart and soul of ECW. He was always in the forefront. He was always working his butt off. And not just the Raven feud, but you name it. His feud with primetime Brian Lee was, crazy at the time. Like, I remember Brian Lee, I believe, choke slammed him off of the the Eagle's Nest, which was the like an upper stage area through like a bunch of tables. So Tommy Dreamer worked hard every night, went through flaming tables, took the chair shots. He was the guy that I remember he always did that drop toe hold into the chair. He was the one that definitely invented that spot. I also remember that when he wrestled Raven in their final match of Raven's original run, that was the first match where I remember like almost excessive use of false finishes. Like the big tease is that Tommy Dreamer had never beat Raven, like you said. And then like I remember Louis Spicolli, I think, ran in and did like the Spicolli driver to Dreamer, and there was all these like false finishes, which I can only think of a couple matches like before that kind of had that kind of vibe going. But yeah, heart and soul of ECW, not only in the ring but behind the scenes. And I think that when ECW was being used in the WWF later on and stuff, like he was always one of their guys. He never really got the, he had his moments, but they didn't really give him much of the spotlight that they did their own guys. But yeah, Tommy Dreamer, number 8, he's the innovator of violence.
Yep. I only have like 2 more things to say on Tommy Dreamer, and then I'll try and move a little faster for you. But when you said heart and soul of ECW, we've mentioned heart and soul of ECW with a few people on this list, but it's, if you're going to put it down to somebody, it's got to be Tommy Dreamer. And it's just that. And another thing I forgot to mention when I think of Tommy Dreamer is when he hit Buela Mcgillicuddy with a pile driver, and like her dress like fell down.
He turned around like 4 times.
Yeah, he turned around. I think he yelled EC, F, and W and then jumped and did it. And a little side note before I forget, earlier I mentioned that Chris Candido was one of the biggest stars to never become a big star. The number 1 person that should have been one of the biggest stars ever but didn't was Magnum TA. I know that's not ECW, but you mentioned him, and that's something I've thought literally since I was a kid. Because I've also watched NWA and WCW like I have ECW since I was a kid. And Magnum TA, it's unfortunate what happened, but he would have been a mega star.
He was the guy in the NWA. He would have been the next babyface champion. And I always thought it would be interesting to think of how Sting and Lex Luger would have fit into the culture, because Magnum TA was being groomed for that spot. And they kind of came a little bit later. I kind of wonder how that mix would have gone. Would Magnum have remained the guy? Would one of those had overtaken him? It's an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think he was supposed to main event the 2nd or 3rd Starrcade against Ric Flair.
There's a urban legend that he was supposed to main event Starrcade 86 with Ric Flair, but in actuality, at the time of his accident, which was 2 months, actually a month and a half before that Starrcade, he had actually just started with Jimmy Garvin, who had come into the area as a heel several months earlier. And Ric Flair was actually supposed to face Ronnie Garvin at Starrcade 86. Like that's what they were going to build toward. But when Magnum got injured, their big change was to turn Nikita Koloff babyface, and to kind of push him to the moon, Nikita got put into that spot with Flair. But a lot of people think it was supposed to be Magnum and Flair at 86, which makes all the sense in the world, especially since Flair and Ron Garvin had been done before. But yeah, at the time of the accident, they were actually doing Magnum TA versus Jimmy Garvin.
Sounds good. So my number 7, and it's gonna sound kind of like I'm repeating myself a little bit with the last 2 people we've talked about, but at 7 I have the Sandman. Talk about crowd participation. This guy had it. He was drinking beers before Stone Cold. I think Stone Cold did it better, but he was still did it first. Obviously not the greatest wrestler on the planet, but he didn't need to be. especially in ECW. He had the greatest pants in the world, those USA pants, but he single-handedly made a weapon extremely famous in the wrestling world. Of course, that whole thing with Tommy Dreamer and Raven, I don't know what came first. The Tommy feud came first, right?
No, the Sandman feud actually came first because the Sandman feud was in 90. Well, you know what? No, you know what?
Close,
The
right?
I think the Dreamer feud was first. Maybe it predated it by like a year.
Okay. But when I think of the Sandman, it's his feud with Tommy Dreamer and really just the caning, his stuff with Raven, getting crucified by Raven, and then selling that he lost his eye was perfect. According to Paul Heyman, he didn't leave his house. He had his wife answer the door because he truly wanted people to think his eye was like gone or messed up because I think Tommy Dreamer shoved a cigarette into it, if I'm remembering right. So Sandman was awesome. He was the attitude of ECW. Minus Paulie, Sandman was the attitude of ECW.
I have Sandman as my number 6, actually. Sandman is kind of like Tommy Dreamer, that you just associate him with ECW. He was like you said, with the slamming the beers all over his head, and he came out to Enter Sandman by Metallica, and he was just like, he was just, a lot of the times he was their top babyface. He was former world champion, and he was a guy that was just willing to do anything in the ring. It didn't matter. The thing about the Sandman that he could get away with that not everybody could is if his shit looked sloppy, it was okay because it's a fucking Sandman.
Yeah, it wasn't necessary. He didn't need to look like Dean Malenko,
He would do this thing where he would do a running dive over the top rope and just land on his feet. Like he would literally just run with the cane, jump over the top rope, and like whack the guy on the floor. Like he had deceptive athleticism. He wasn't super polished or anything like that, but always worked hard. Great ring entrances. Great with the beer thing. And I think that again, when you think of ECW, you think of the Sandman, and you could kind of juggle him and Tommy Dreamer kind of either way. But yeah, I got Sandman as my number 6.
Nice. So who do you have as your number 7?
So my number 7 is Taz.
Okay.
So Taz originally wrestled in ECW as the Tasmaniac. Mm-hmm. He was kind of a relatively short guy, but he was suplexing dudes all over the place. And you could see that he had some like raw ability that hadn't quite been tapped into. He had a tag team with Sabu that was fun to watch. And then when he turned heel and he just became Taz and he cut his hair and he had Fonzie with him, that's when he really came into his own as an overall talent, I felt. The feud with Sabu was one of the best feuds in ECW history. I think it had the best build to any match in company history.
For sure.
Taz was always a guy that worked hard, seemed legit. Whether he could or couldn't, you really believed that he could kick any dude's ass of any size. They would bring in guys and feed him. Paul Varlins from the UFC came in and Taz, destroyed him. And I remember when Chris Jericho came in, he wrestled Taz and got beat in like 5 minutes. Taz was just running through dudes. And then the feud with Bam Bigelow, I think it may have been arguably his best series of matches, but he had good matches with everybody, was there. He has the longevity. He has the impact. He went on to have a very successful post ECW career, and I have him as my number 7.
Awesome. I love it. I have Taz at my number 5. But I'm also going to tell you my number 6 because 6 is next, and we were just talking about Taz. So at 6, I have Sabu. 5, I have Taz. I freaking love Sabu, and I think partially it's because he reminds me of Hayabusa. Obviously, we all know the stories. I mean, they're not stories; they're true. He would get cut open, and he'd like glue himself together, like in the ring. Like it was crazy. The double jump flips on the chair, amazing. And what I was going to talk about with Sabu and Taz really was their feud leading up to Barely Legal. The way that the lights would go out and the crowd knew who it was because the lights only go out for one person. And Sandman would be in there just pointing, and the crowd would go nuts. And I think of the iconic promo, and I honestly can't really remember anything else from this promo. But at the end, Taz goes, "Sabu, I'm going to choke you out." And I love it. It's so intense. And I would never mess with Taz. He could kick me in the face and I would apologize and ask what I did wrong. And their match at Barely Legal actually disappointed me, but I feel like that's the general consensus with that first match. And then about a year or two later, they have a title unification match. I don't remember which pay-per-view, but it was much better. Much, much better.
I'll talk about Sabu a little bit later.
Okay.
I did want to say, as far as their Barely Legal match, I didn't find it disappointing. I think it lived up to the hype. I thought it was the second best match on the first ECW pay-per-view, behind the Michinoku Pro 6-man tag. Although I say that, and I also remember that Stevie Richards versus Terry Funk versus the Sandman was a really good match, also like a ladder match. It's funny because I'm actually going to do an ECW Barely Legal, not really a watch along, but a review with somebody else here in the coming future, and I'll get a chance to rewatch it. But for me, it lived up to it, but it had been built up so big that, inevitably for some people it wasn't going to live up to that hype.
I suppose, and I've seen so many documentaries on ECW, whether it's a WWE made like top 100 moments, or even there was a non-WWE documentary made called The Unauthorized Story of ECW, and they all hype up the Taz and Sabu story, which they should. It's fantastic. It's just something about the match. It was a great match, but I don't know what I was expecting, but it was more. I was expecting more. Right. I think what I was expecting was the way their second match went. And it's bothering me that I can't remember the name of the pay-per-view because I watched it a couple days ago. But that's what I wanted from the first match. And especially since it was the first pay-per-view, it would have been cool to see them go absolutely like all out.
In all honesty, I don't even remember their second match, but I know that I would have seen it at the time. So I'd have to go back and watch it.
It's good. I think it's better than their first one. So I definitely recommend you do that. It's on Peacock. Little plug for the people who are watching. So do you need to do your number 6, right?
It looks like it would be your number 5 because I had the Sandman that you had at number 8. So we're ready for your number 5.
Okay, so my number 5 was Taz. I guess I should expand on Taz a little bit more. I mentioned all the Sabu stuff. Taz single-handedly got a finisher over with the crowd the way I feel like almost just hasn't been seen before, besides the Hogan leg drop. If he locks in that Taz mission, and he did it so quick.
The Kota Hajime.
The Taz mission, yes. The crowd, they would all stand up and lose their mind, and they knew the opponent tapping out was coming, and when the opponent tapped out, they'd lose their minds even more. Even if it was a local guy, they lost their minds if he put the submission in. And then he's got his stuff with Bam Bigelow that we talked about with Bam Bam. So I think the obvious thing to mention here would be the FTW Championship. And how do you get a pretend title? Not that it's pretend, because I'd never say that to Taz, but how do you get a non-official title over the way that it was over? Actually, I think his match with Sabu was for the world title and the FTW title, and I think it was the only time that it was officially defended on ECW. So that stuff, Taz is a genius, an absolute genius. I think at
He's
the time,
still awesome. His promos are probably right up there with the best in wrestling today, if not the best.
Yeah, he's always been able to talk. It's ridiculous. And he's getting his group in AEW over now. I think his name's Powerhouse Hobbs, the big guy. You got Brian Cage, Ricky Starks, who at first I didn't understand why Ricky Starks was in their group. But with Taz can get anything over. He got a finisher over. He got a submission finisher over in 1995 to 97, which I feel like at the time getting a submission finisher over, if your name's not Bret Hart, would be impossible. So, I mean, I have nothing but positive things to say about Taz, and we pretty much covered all the other stuff. So if you'd like to say anything, or if you'd like to do your number 5.
I'll go ahead and move on to my number 5 because I think I talked enough about Taz. But yeah, great pick. And yeah, what you said about submission wrestling, he was one of the first guys that had people tapping out. I don't know if him or Shamrock started it. I feel like Taz did, but I saw them kind of talking to each other on Twitter, and I think it had to be Taz because Taz was choking dudes out in like 96, and that predated Shamrock as far as his WWF era run. So my number 5 is a tag team that I feel doesn't get their due, and people do not list them in the same light as they do Sandman and Sabu and all these guys.
Okay.
But I feel like the reason that they get overlooked is because of the time period that they were there and what they went on to become. My number 5 is Rocco Rock and Johnny Grunge, the Public Enemy.
Yep.
So in 94, when I started watching ECW, the two like coolest acts in ECW were Sabu, who was like one of the hottest things in wrestling, for sure on the independent scene, and Public Enemy. Public Enemy were having these wild brawls with whether it be the Bad Breed or the Gangstas or the Pit Bulls. They had these like great matches, and they were putting people through tables too, just like Sabu was. It's yet another example of Paul Heyman's genius. He took two journeyman wrestlers. Rocco Rock had wrestled as the Cheetah Kid. Johnny Grunge was just a random independent guy. He put them together as these, South Philly hoodies, and they became, now as far as like bell to bell in like a standard wrestling match, Public Enemy were not one of the best tag teams in the ring. But in ECW and within their environment where they were allowed to shine, they were absolutely one of the best tag teams of their time together in ECW. I feel they get overlooked. As far as ECW tag teams, I feel like people go towards the Dudleys or even the Eliminators, but they forget about Public Enemy, who I consider the OGs. They were the first main event tag team in ECW, and they had great matches. They had great feuds. They had very entertaining promos. They were from 94 to 95. They had that heart and soul of ECW. And unfortunately, once they left, they never were able to recapture it. Even in WCW, where they got to have like a couple of good brawls, they were kind of exposed because they weren't as great as they had been made to look in ECW. But that's just an unfortunate thing that happened. But yeah, I have Public Enemy as number 5. I feel really confident with that pick, and I feel that they're very overlooked.
It's a great pick. I didn't expect them to be. I expected them to be in your honorable mentions. So I'm actually going to mention somebody who I also have in my honorable mentions. He's not part of the Public Enemy, but it's somebody who I think is overlooked in ECW, and it's Axel Rotten. I originally had Axel Rotten as my 15 or 14, and the stuff that man went through with his brother. Was it his brother?
Yeah, Ian Rotten.
Okay, yeah, his brother. The Taipei death match with the glass around the fists. I think Axel Rotten is so instrumental in those very early years of ECW. I mean, that's really. I thought about it. And I wanted to mention it before I forgot, but I have Axel Rotten as an honorable mention, and Public Enemy is a good pick. They're the OGs of teams throwing people through tables. Rocco Rock is the one with the darker hair, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I remember watching him do a backflip off a cage through, I want to say, 2 tables. They were so fun to watch, and then they went to WCW, and it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but it's not the same. WCW did not do the hardcore stuff well at all.
Right.
And then by the time Public Enemy got to WWE, despite the WWE clearly getting the hardcore stuff from ECW, they're not the same at all to me. So the Public Enemy, I think their first match was against the Acolytes, or it might have been against the Dudleys, but I know they refused to go through tables for some reason, and they just got the hell beat out of them. And I think they had like 1 or 2 more matches, and they were gone.
That was an unfortunate thing, because I know they got the shit beat out of them, legit, and from what I understand, they weren't allowed to fight back. Like, they just had to eat shit, and it was at a time where a lot of the WWF guys hated guys from WCW, and they wanted to send a message, and they did.
All right, on my number 4, or is that where we're at?
Yes.
Okay, so my number 4 would not be on most people's top 15, probably. My number 4 is the king of old school style. It is Steve Carino. He is another one of my favorite wrestlers ever. He's in my top 20 favorite wrestlers ever. When I was a kid, I wanted long blonde hair, and it was because of him. And when I was in wrestling school, my finish was the super kick. And I think people kind of might have assumed just because I love Shawn Michaels so much, I was inspired to do that from Steve Carino. So that's the personal reason behind having him so high. The other reasons are kind of the same reasons I like Just Incredible as the later stuff in ECW. The matches like at Massacre on 34th Street, Guilty as Charged, Steve Carino could always go. And he's another example. If ECW was around a little bit longer, I think Steve Carino would have been such a bigger name. And I think he's with the WWE now, doing coaching and whatnot and producing. He was great in Ring of Honor. He didn't really wrestle. He was a commentator. He had his last match ever against Kevin Owens, known as Kevin Steen, in Ring of Honor. But Steve Carino, to me, is he's a star, especially for a company like ECW at the time. And he was great at visuals. If the only person that could hold a candle to blading like Steve Carino could was Ric Flair. And when the long blonde hair turns all red, it's so cool. But Steve Carino is my number 4.
Awesome. I know I mentioned Carino earlier and that he didn't make my list. And like I said, there's also where I skew more towards the 94 to 99 ECW stars. And I'm pretty sure Carino was there in 1999. He was a great heel. He was a fresh act for them, where he came in with Jack Victory. He was doing the King of Old School stuff. And I really think that during the final years of ECW, he was one of the bright spots for sure.
Yeah.
And so I think that him making your list is great because he does deserve to, be mentioned along with these other guys. He worked his butt off. I love that he had the old school flavor. I love that he had the feud with Dusty Rhodes, and he would do the deal where he would like, you know, I, I think he was the one that put the chair down in the ring and put on the headlock as one of his like heel tactics to like, as an FU to the ECW arena crowd. Very good promo. He was a guy that was always like around, and I believe the Northeast Independents. I would always see his name. And then once he dyed that hair blonde and went the heel route in ECW, it was straight to the top.
Straight to the top. And earlier I mentioned how Tommy Dreamer became a star kind of just with that thing with Sandman. Steve Carino, that match with Dusty and the feud, if I was going to pinpoint when Steve Carino shot to the top, it would have been that. And that's all the credit in the world to Dusty Rhodes, because if it was anybody else and really any other kind of match, it probably wouldn't have been the same. He still would have got to the top of ECW. He was on his way there, but put it over with Dusty.
Carino, what you said with him having the blonde hair and the bleeding. Well, he grew up watching the guys that did that. I have no doubt he grew up watching Tommy Rich bleeding all over the place with his blonde hair and Dusty Rhodes. And I know that me and Steve Carino could have been friends because when he was a kid, he dressed up like the Rock and Roll Express for the Rock and Roll Express look-alike contest. So I know that we would have been best friends.
That's awesome. All right. Your number 4?
My number 4 is basically the guy that I consider to have had the longest main event run in ECW, and that's the franchise Shane Douglas. Shane Douglas was always a very good wrestler before ECW. I think his peak for me was his time teaming with Ricky Steamboat in WCW as the tag team champions and their matches with like the Hollywood Blondes. But he was always a very good talent. And then when he went to ECW and he got a chance to be a heel, he really came into his own. He was a great heel. He had great promos. He had good matches. The match where he beat Too Cold Scorpio for the NWA title and threw the belt down and kind of shit on all the past champions was a classic moment in building ECW and its kind of aura. He was always, it seemed like, in that world title position. If he wasn't the champion, he was the challenger. He was the leader of the Triple Threat, which was the top heel stable for years. He had Francine with him. He was a talented wrestler, great promo. I don't think his matches were what I would consider the best on most of the ECW shows, but they were good.
Yeah,
they were good. And I think some of my favorite ones he had the match with Cactus Jack at CyberSlam 96, but I actually really liked his feud with Pitbull number 2. They had a really good feud, and he broke Pitbull 1's neck, or broke his neck, and Gary Wolf was in a halo for a while. I know that Shane's match with Pitbull 2 at Barely Legal didn't live up to some of their past matches, I don't think. But Shane Douglas, just a true main event act in ECW, and he's my number 4.
So I'm actually going to just move on to my number 3 because my number 3 is the franchise Shane Douglas. For the same reasons you just said. And when he broke Pitbull's neck, I think of that time when he grabs him by the halo and he just yanks him around and everyone's gasping and people don't know what to do because they don't know if he's really hurt or not. Like, why would you? There's just the visual that's so dark. And
I knew what wrestling was at the time, but I actually bought into it. It's one of the few things I was actually buying into at the time.
It's good. It's great stuff. And as far as his promos go, I can't think of a bad one. The guy had the gift of gab. He really liked dropping the F-bomb in promos. It was just a thing he did. And we talked about him a little bit earlier because I have the rest of the triple threat in my list. He has the most memorable of world title reigns in ECW for me. He truly was that. He was the franchise. He looked like a world champion from when he was in the ring to when he'd walk out to when he was in the ring. His promos. He didn't need to wear a suit to look like a world champion. I think he was right place, right time for ECW. I don't know if he would have been as big of a star if he entered ECW into those latter years, because you had young guys like Steve Carino, Just Incredible, Rhino. Shane Douglas was right guy, right time. And I don't have anything bad to say about him. He's great on commentary too. He was hurt for like a couple pay-per-views, I think. I think it was a leg injury. Could have been a shoulder injury, but he was on commentary. He was awesome to listen to.
I like your point about if he came to ECW later, because at the time when he really came into his own as a heel in 1994, he was still pretty young, and he really hadn't been overexposed. He hadn't really gotten that giant push. And if his time hadn't come until 1999, he would have been not old, but he would have been a guy that people had seen for much longer, and maybe they wouldn't have accepted him in that spot as easily. Not that he didn't have the talent to overcome it, but I think it would have been a more difficult ride for him. So my number 3 is the whole effing show, Rob Van Dam.
Great pick.
I was a fan of RVD dating back to 1992. Right at the end of 1992, he came into WCW under Bill Watts's reign, and immediately I became a fan. He had this cool slicked back hair and a ponytail. He looked like Jean-Claude Van Damme.
Yeah, it's totally got his name.
Yeah, and he just did all this really cool athletic stuff, a lot of karate based stuff, and he didn't get used a lot there, but he had some good showings, and there was times that he would get to beat some of the lower card guys like Scotty Flamingo or Shanghai Pierce, and he'd be competitive with the guys that were pushed. But I was always disappointed that they didn't use him better. I always wanted him to get that Too Cold Scorpio push in WCW. So then when he showed up in ECW, the first real thing that kind of put him on the map was a series of matches he had with Sabu, and they were great matches. They had a stretcher match. I remember from, I believe it was at the A Doctor Is In event, and I know they had the respect match where the loser had to say they respect the other person. And then, of course, everybody remembers the series of matches with Jerry Lynn, and we already talked about that. Right around the time of Barely Legal, I would say in the few months that followed Barely Legal was really the time where he came into his own and kind of organically became ECW's top star. Great matches, a unique style, someone that didn't do a cookie cutter routine. He was his own individual self, and that's why I appreciated him so much. Hard worker, very athletic. RVD was one of the most popular guys ECW ever had, and he raised and elevated the television title to where it was arguably bigger than the world title during the time that he held it.
I would say so, because if you go back and watch shows, they've even said it in interviews, when RVD was at the height of his popularity, I'm not saying they were one-match shows, but the crowd was there to see Rob Van Dam. He had a badass entrance song he'd walk out to, Walk By Pantera, something for the crowd to participate with. He had the whole stoner gimmick, which wasn't a gimmick, it's him, but he could also whoop your ass if he needed to. Everything about him was very relatable to people, and he's also so much fun to watch. He's so smooth. I remember spots where him and Jerry Lynn would they'd flip over each other, they'd miss, they'd try to do like a leg drop, the other one would miss, the other one would go for a leg drop, they'd miss, and they'd stand up and they'd do this to each other, and it would get a standing ovation. It's so great. I mean, I still have Rob Van Dam coming up, so I could say more. But do you want to do your number 2?
Sure. I can move on to my number 2. So Rob Van Dam was my number 3, and my number 2 is Terry Funk. So the reason Terry Funk is my number 2, and he was a guy that would always he would be there for a while and then he would come back. Terry Funk brought a legitimate legend main eventer to ECW during its inception that helped to give them credibility. He was a guy that was one of the greatest wrestlers in the history of the business, and he reinvented himself in ECW by doing a more kind of a brawling style. He started doing moonsaults, which he actually had started doing in Smoky Mountain Wrestling in '94. But the reason I rank Terry Funk is the impact that he had, the credibility that he brought, that he lended to everyone else unselfishly with his legendary status. The first ECW pay-per-view, one of the most emotional matches to me in wrestling history was when Terry Funk defeats Raven for the belt, and he's in the crowd and he's bloody and he's crying, and this had been built up so well. And Terry Funk came out to the song Desperado, and it just really got you in the feels. And I remember as a teenager just watching this. He was 53 years old at the time, and back then, it's more common today to have guys that are maybe of that age doing some stuff in the ring still. But at the time, to have a 53-year-old on the top of your company was, not common. So I have Terry Funk at number 2 because of all that he brought to the table with his legendary status, the great matches he had, and the great memories that he provided in ECW.
I respect that a lot, and so I actually don't have Terry Funk on my list, and it's not for any negative reasons. He's on my honorable mentions. When I like the stuff I like about Terry Funk was the stuff he did in with Ric Flair in WCW, NWA, like turning on him, their match together. That's the stuff I really like about Terry Funk. Not that I didn't like his ECW stuff, but after Barely Legal, he wasn't really. He's kind of gone. He went to WWE. And it was great that visual of Terry Funk holding up the title, and then the feed cuts because they had like 5 seconds left on their pay-per-view or something. It's fantastic. And it's Terry Funk was so helpful to ECW. Him being there, they needed a big name. I don't know if they needed it desperately. I don't know their situation at the time, but it helps every new company. And Terry Funk was selfless. I assume he always has been. He seems like a great guy. And he just elevated anybody who was with him at the time. So nothing but respect to Terry Funk. All right. Let's see. My number 2, kind of already talked about it. The Dudleys are my number 2. I already kind of went in depth with how I feel Devon deserves more recognition for what he did. Bubba definitely got a stutter over, which was awesome. And their matches were nuts. And when I put the Dudleys at number 2, I'm mostly putting Bubba and Devon, but it's the other Dudleys as well. Sign Guy Dudley, Spike Dudley, Big Dick Dudley. Big Dick Dudley's awesome. I don't know why I like him so much, but I do. And the whole backstory about how they're all from different places. They all have different dads. That's Devon's black, Bubba's white, But when they got serious and it was time to go, putting people through tables, flaming tables was a theme towards their latter years in ECW. But I think an underlooked part of the Dudley Boys aura there is Joel Gertner.
I was just thinking that as soon as you said an overlooked part, I thought we've not mentioned Joel Gertner.
Joel Gertner is so good. He's awesome. His mic skills, whether they were planned or not, he's so underrated, and he is on my honorable mentions. I wish he had that gimmick of being sleazy and all that. I wish he had it the whole time, just so there was more content for me to watch. But Joel Gertner was an underrated, overlooked aspect of the Dudley Boys.
He would always, I remember he would open the ECW pay-per-views with Joey Styles a lot of times, and he would start his rant, and you never knew where it was going. It was always very long, and you'd be like wondering like what's the next thing he's going to say, and then it would all come together. Mm-hmm. Very entertaining guy for sure.
Yeah, he always got and towards the end of ECW, he'd start rhyming and stuff, and it's just got the biggest pop from the fans, and it always entertains me to this day. I've watched him 1,000 times. And he'll just say, well, 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 and the fans explode.
Yeah.
You did your number 2, right?
Yes. And you have the Dudleys number 2?
Yep. Do you have any more honorable mentions you'd like to list off?
So for honorable mentions, I had already mentioned Jerry Lynn, Mike Awesome, and Chris Candido. The other 2 that I had in kind of that next 5 that didn't make my list were Mikey Whipwreck.
Mm-hmm. I haven't.
Mikey was a guy that was always around. He worked very hard, just as hard as Tommy Dreamer or the Sandman. He was a good wrestler. He had a lot of really good matches, and his tag team with Tajiri in the later years was having a lot of really good matches too. Mikey was in some of the best storylines. I loved his storyline with Cactus Jack. And I feel like that anytime that you do a retrospective on ECW, you have to mention Mikey Whipwreck. And I think he's another one like Public Enemy that might get overlooked sometimes.
Yep. I also have Mikey Whipwreck, former world champion. He's got to be on the list.
Yeah, he beat Steve Austin's ass too. So
he beats superstar Steve Austin. And yeah, the stuff with I think a Cactus Jack and Mikey Whipwreck together. And then you have the stuff with Tajiri and the Sinister Minister. And that stuff was really cool too. I feel like towards when he was with Tajiri, that's when people started looking at him as an actual wrestler and not kind of the underdog babyface, like this is a miracle if he wins kind of thing. So right. I'll mention a couple of the other people I have real quick. We talked about Cactus Jack, Terry Funk, Tanaka. So I'm going to name like 3 or 4 other people. I'll be real fast about it. They were on my honorable mentions. Kid Kash is one of them. Kid Kash is another one of those younger guys at the time where he really could have benefited from ECW lasting a little bit longer. We all know the famous spots where if there's a crowd of wrestlers brawling,
springboard flip.
You can every time 100%er, you could guarantee Kid Kash you're going to get your money well spent. So I think he would have been a much bigger deal. And I wish his career in general to kind of casual fans was a bigger deal. He did some stuff in WWE, but it wasn't the most notable thing in the world. He's a former cruiserweight champion. I think he was a tag champion with Jamie Noble in the WWE. I know he had tag title matches with Jamie Noble in the WWE. I put Buela McGillicuddy up there. Cyrus the Virus. 911. Because how can you not like somebody who's just going to come break up a really crappy match and just choke slam him to hell?
Right.
And the final one, and this guy is on my honorable mentions solely because of one appearance he made. He made more than one appearance, I think, but this one appearance he made me a fan of him forever, and that's Brian Pillman's appearance at CyberSlam 96. the way the lights would come on and he was just holding that cane, he looked so badass. He's another guy. I think I would have liked if he would have stayed there. I think Brian Pillman, ECW 96, was right place, right time. I don't fully know what happened there, but he went to WWE. That was right after his fallout with Kevin Sullivan in WCW, and I don't know how much of that was a work. But so that's the last of my honorable mentions.
Gotcha. So the only guy I hadn't mentioned yet that was on my honorable mentioned list was New Jack. I
have New Jack. I'm sorry.
Gotcha. And I'm going to talk about some of the people you talked about as well that didn't make my honorable mentions. But New Jack was a guy that I was a huge Gangstas fan from their time in Smoky Mountain Wrestling. I can still to this day recite his Night of the Legends promo almost verbatim. And when they went to ECW, that actually fit them better because they got to do the wild brawls and stuff. And then unfortunately, Mustafa and him had a falling out, I think, and Mustafa left or whatever. And but New Jack was, if you had asked me during the height of ECW, who is your favorite guy in ECW, it would have been New Jack. It's not because I thought he was the best wrestler. It's just I loved his promos. I loved him since he was in Smoky Mountain, and I always look forward to seeing him. And so New Jack makes my honorable mention list for sure.
New Jack's awesome to watch. He's somebody I forgot to mention on my honorable mentions, but he is there. When the fans got accustomed to him coming out and the music would not stop playing, and he'd come out almost only if he didn't have a scheduled match, he'd only come out when it was chaotic, and you would hear that song, and the fans would just be like, "Oh my god!" And he'd come out with a shopping cart of anything.
Right.
He's always fun to watch.
And I wanted to talk about some of your honorable mentions. Kid Kash was a guy that at the end of the company was really, I know I believe he won the television title too. He was really coming to his own, and that kind of gave him like a springboard, no pun intended, to being recognized. And yeah, I do think if ECW had kept on going, he would have really just continued moving upward in the card and been, perhaps more remembered than he is today. Buela Mcgillicuddy, like I said, with Francine, they're the two females that you most associate with ECW, and she had the match with Fonzie that was one of the best, manager matches I've ever seen, and one of my favorite. I'm as far as intergender matches go, like they really knocked it out of the park when they had their bloody match at the ECW arena.
Rumor has it that match saved Bill Alfonso's career.
I remember hearing that on one of the WWE produced ECW documentaries.
Tommy Dreamer says it. Don't know how true it is, but if it's true, that's really cool. And it makes sense because if they went all out for like a going away match, he thought that was going to be his last match, and it saved his career. And then you have Bill Alfonso whistling nonstop during Sabu and RVD matches after that.
Mm-hmm. I also wanted to talk about 911. It was, such a cool gimmick. This was a guy that had been around, like he had wrestled in Florida in the mid 80s as Tombstone. Like he had been around, and Paulie had worked with him before, I think, in like either in, I'm trying to put the timeline together, but I think at some point him and Paulie maybe linked up before this. But anyway, in ECW, you took a guy that was relatively limited as a wrestler, and he had one job. He just came out there and did the choke slam, and he had the awesome Heavenly Bodies music, the Edgar Winter Frankenstein theme, which I actually used that theme on a show I wrestled on in Topeka as a heel because I'm a big fan of it.
That's awesome.
911 was one of the great characters from the early days of ECW that unfortunately he was another one that went to WCW, and kind of fell out of favor. I remember reading that he refused to do a job to Taz during, and that's what got him the boot, is they wanted him to get choked out by Taz after Taz had turned heel, and he wouldn't do it. I mean, because if you think about it, he'd gone years just choke slamming dudes and not ever losing. And but Taz was their guy, and they were building him up, and that was the end of his run. But yeah, he was fun to watch for sure. And then Cyrus, on the in the ECW on TNN era, he was very good in that kind of heel role that he had. Is and he's still a good promo to this day.
Yeah, Don Callis is easy to hate, and I mean that. I mean that in the nicest and best way possible. Because what the stuff he's doing with Kenny Omega now, you can go back to ECW and see similar stuff to it, except he's not really, at least for a while, not managing anybody. He's the network, and he's just easy to hate, slimy little shit. Like
right. There are so many others that we haven't even named. The FBI, Tracy Smothers and Little Guido with Tommy Rich, like just a great opening match heel gimmick that eventually got a run with the belts. But they, I remember Taz saying once that even he was entertained by the FBI. Just a great way to, have the show open or do the second match on the card.
For sure. I mean, like you said, there's people we haven't mentioned. Like, I could mention the Guerrero Malenko Classic. I could like those two simply because of those matches and that final match. Psychosis, Rey Mysterio, and many others, but you can only make a list.
Those matches were so great. Ray and Juventud had a great match in the arena and in Queens. But yeah, there's just so many guys that it's hard to. Balls Mahoney and Axel Rotten, they always worked hard. They were heart and soul of ECW, making the most out of two guys that were both, good wrestlers. Balls Mahoney used to wrestle in Smoky Mountain as Boo Bradley, and I saw his ability then. But they really kind of found something in ECW as a tag team for sure. And others that just, don't really get mentioned a lot. The comedy bits with the BWO was pretty big for a while, but even before that, Stevie Richards and the Blue Meanie, they did the Kiss thing at the ECW arena where they dressed up as Kiss, and all of those kind of moments were just memorable for ECW fans. The Pitbulls were a tag team that went out there and wrestled hard all the time, and they were big, but they can move. And
C.W. Anderson towards the later years.
Yeah, C.W. Anderson. He had the feud with Tommy Dreamer. Was always a very good, solid wrestler. I loved when they brought in Tommy Rogers of the Fantastics, and he was hitting people with a Tamikaze, which he actually had invented, and then Christian took it and started using it as his finisher, but Tommy Rogers was the first guy to do that.
Yeah, there's just so many people that, at us as big ECW fans, we're just going to continue to think of endless amounts of people. That's why this list was a lot harder than I thought. It was easy for me to think of 15 to 25 people, but once I had to put them in a list, that was not easy, besides my number one, which I can transition to.
Right, and I will say I'm at 6% on my battery, so we definitely need to get these number ones out there.
I will make it quick. Probably no surprise to you, but for people who don't know, my number one is the whole effing show. Rob Van Dam, Mr. Monday Night, Mr. Pay-Per-View, 700 days as television champion. His accolades can go on, and my love for him doesn't stop at ECW. During the Invasion angle, when he had a cool debut, he came out of nowhere and frog splashed Kurt Angle or Jericho or Stone Cold, one of those three. He had an incredible hardcore title reign in 2001. He had matches with Jeff Hardy at Invasion and SummerSlam, a great ladder match at SummerSlam. At No Mercy 2001, he was still the hardcore champion, and he was in the main event WWE title match against Stone Cold and Kurt Angle. And there was a possibility that Rob Van Dam was going to win. That's how legit and over he was, even still in WWE. And greatest frog splash ever. Sorry, Art Bar. Greatest frog splash ever. To talk about his ECW stuff, first time I saw Rob Van Dam, like I've said a couple times now, was Heatwave 98 in that tag match. And it's my favorite ECW match ever. A lot of people think that tag match fell short of what it should have been, which I can kind of see why, but I have some sentimental reasons behind it. And then just for 2 years, Rob Van Dam just cleaning the division with the television title, not losing. Nobody thought he would lose. As soon as he hit the frog splash, it was over. He had great matches against Bam Bigelow, Sabu, of course, the Jerry Lynn matches. I can't remember this guy's name right now, and you will, but Rob Van Dam busted out the Van Terminator against him with the chair from the coast to coast with the chair. It was an old buddy of his.
Oh, Scott Anton?
Yes. Yeah.
Scotty Riggs, yeah.
So that, not the whole show, but that whole match was built around RVD debuting this new move he calls the Van Terminator, and nobody knew what it was until he hits this crazy ass move, and that's obviously it, and he wins. All the way up until his final match with Jerry Lynn, and they all delivered. Rob Van Dam never disappointed. From his first pay-per-view match, Barely Legal against Lance Storm, it's all good. I do the frog splash too when I was in wrestling school, and that's why. So Rob Van Dam has always been an influence and an idol of mine since I was a kid. Can't say enough great things about him.
Awesome. And as I mentioned, I had him as my number 3. Definitely one of the first guys you think about when it comes to ECW.
Mm-hmm.
So for my number 1, is Sabu.
Mm-hmm.
Sabu was a guy that even before I was watching in ECW, I was reading about him. The magazine started like showing pictures of the crazy stuff he was doing. Nobody was doing this stuff at a time. Nobody was putting people through tables regularly. He was doing like moonsaults and flips out of the ring, and so he started getting a lot of notoriety from the independents, and it really made you excited to see him. And I remember the first match I saw him in was Hardcore Heaven '94 against Too Cold Scorpio, and they had a good match, but Sabu to me epitomized ECW because he was a guy that he made his own name with his own style, very unique, innovative, triple jump moonsault. Mm-hmm. He had great matches with guys like Cactus Jack and Rob Van Dam. He always worked his ass off in the ring, no matter how many people were there, and you can always depend on him. But the reason I put him as my number 1 is because in those early days of ECW, he was the guy. If you were a fan, he was the guy that you looked forward to seeing the most. He was the guy that kind of drew you into watching ECW. It was all about Sabu from like 94 to probably, I would say 94, 95 were really Sabu's peak as far as like, growth, as far as popularity. And then even, fast forward into Barely Legal in 97, he was still one of their top guys, one of their most popular guys, and one of their most enduring stars. But largely, it's because, to me, he was one of the key dudes that put ECW on the map, and he is my number 1 largely because he is the guy that I think is the most synonymous for me with ECW.
Yeah, you can't go wrong with Sabu at number 1. I think I had him at like 6 or something of that sorts, but you can't go wrong with Sabu at number 1. I mean, everything you just said, right on the nail. Like, if you say ECW, a lot of people are going to say Sabu. Like, who do they think of? And Sabu with Fonzie was great. Sabu with RVD was great. Sabu's single stuff, fantastic. Obviously, we've talked about how his stuff with Taz was the best feud, like leading up to a match in ECW history. So great pick. I completely see where you're coming from with Sabu.
He would tear his body up. The Born to Be Wired barbed wire match with Terry Funk.
That was crazy.
He could brawl. He could fly. He could hit great spots. He could fuck up a lot of spots. He was the man. And just like with Sabu, I think RVD is a great choice as your number one. I think we got some pretty good lists.
I think so too.
Awesome. We'll have to do this again. I think the ECW is a great topic for us to talk about.
For sure.
So we'll have to do this again sometime soon and find another reason to come together and talk some ECW.
Yeah, man, we can watch a pay-per-view and then dissect it and get on the pod. We can do whatever, man. I am down to do this.
Yeah, we're gonna do that for sure. All right, until next time, thanks for joining me, Kota Hawkins, to talk about the top 15 ECW MVPs. It was a lot of fun, and we'll have to talk about some more ECW real soon.
Sounds great, man.
All right, everybody. I hope you enjoyed that episode talking about ECW. Thank you to Kota for coming on and sharing his perspective. Kota is 21 years old, I think, and he went back and watched ECW later on. So he had a very much different perspective than me, who is 41 years old and watched ECW in real time. I like that our perspectives were different because we got to talk about, a lot more people that way. I know that he had a lot more people on his honorable mention list than I did. I kept it at 5. If I could add some people, the people I would add would be Joey Styles. Joey Styles easily could have made the top 15. He's as synonymous with ECW as anybody. Was the lead announcer. Oftentimes, most of the time, he was a one-man show. For all the pay-per-views and ECW on TNN and the syndicated show. Joey Styles was a great announcer that fit ECW perfectly. Also, as honorable mentions, I would add Tajiri and Super Crazy. Excellent wrestlers. Together, they had arguably the best matches in ECW history. You can make a case for that. I think the only reason I didn't have them on originally as honorable mentions is because I just always see them as wrestling each other or Little Guido. They didn't have the kind of varied programs and storylines and main events that some of the other guys did, even if they were better in the ring. But I bet their longevity was probably a little more than I give them credit for, having not researched it. I bet they were in ECW longer than I would guess. It feels like they were there for like a year and a half, maybe 2 years, but it probably was longer. Also, as honorable mentions, I would add Just Incredible and Lance Storm, but I would put them on as individuals. The Impact Players was a good run, but I just as strongly remember them as singles competitors and Lance Storm's team with Chris Candido. So I actually would have them on as individuals. Also, as far as my top 15 list, one thing I would change is I think I kind of slept on Mike Awesome. If I could go back, I would probably put Mike Awesome somewhere between number 12 and number 15, probably on the higher end of that. The thing with making these kind of lists is that, depending on the week, your picks could change number to number. So with Mike Awesome, I do think that he would for sure crack my top 15, probably around number 12. But anyway, hope you guys enjoyed watching and stay tuned for the next episode.